Welcome to Canada's most irreverent talk show. This is The Andrew Lawton Show, brought to you by True North.
Hello and welcome to The Andrew Lawton Show here on True North. Do not adjust your set. Yes, I know, it's a different TV show. I do not have an Outer Limits coffee mug. I have to have my Twilight Zone coffee mug. I blame inflation. My name is Kris Sims. I'm the Alberta Director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Andrew and the team at True North have been very kind to me, asking me to fill in for Andrew this week. But don't worry, you will have him back from his secret assignment in an undisclosed location very soon. So we have a really interesting show for you today. We're going to touch a little bit on capital gains tax. What is that exactly? How is it going to affect you? What on earth is the Trudeau government doing with it now to screw things up? Then we're going to go to the role of government and media, particularly government in media. So those of you who have watched the Canadian Taxpayers Federation or watched any of our conversations with Andrew Lawton on True North, you know where we stand. We want to defund the CBC. We don't think any taxpayers' money or government money, as they call it, should be going to media organizations because, well, one, it's a huge waste of money, and two, it's an obvious conflict of interest. So one of the fundamental roles of a journalist, doesn't matter if they're coming at this from a right wing or left wing or whatever ideology, is to speak truth to power and to hold government to account. Sorry, guys, you can't hold government to account if you're counting on government for your paycheck. So we're going to do a nice deep dive into that murky territory with Peter Menzies, longtime journalist, longtime editor and publisher of the Calgary Herald, and even did some time on the CRTC board. So he's got some really interesting takes there. And every now and then, I think it's important to remind ourselves that we aren't alone. Taxpayers, Canadian citizens. If you're getting screwed by the government here in Canada, at least take comfort in the fact that you're not alone. Across the pond, we actually have some cousins in the Taxpayer Alliance. We're going to be joining them later on in the show, highlighting some of the wacky wastes of money that's happening across the pond over there in the UK because, hey, they've got an election coming up. What better time to highlight stuff like that? And we're going to leave you with an absolutely ridiculous story. I'm just going to tease it like this. If you were getting together with some buddies to go deer hunting, what would you bring with you? What sort of a vehicle would you drive? Keep that in mind because at the end of the show, we're going to be joining my colleague Carson Binda. He's the BC director of the Canadian Taxpayers Federation with the story that I almost didn't believe. I thought that they were pulling my leg. So really good show for you today, as Ed Sullivan would say. So let's start with the capital gains tax. So rewind, dear listener, rewind, dear viewer, to before the budget. So before the budget, we were hearing all sorts of rumors. So we were seeing trial balloons for a grocery store tax. Okay. There were so many trial balloons up there in Ottawa, they blotted out the sun. Like the media said it was an eclipse, but we know what those were. It was the trial balloons for a grocery store tax. So hopefully and luckily that didn't happen. I say hopefully because you never know with this government. Just wait. The other element was a so-called wealth tax. And this is where you get into this sort of, let's go hang out in the quad with our sociology class and chat about eating the rich, shall we, in university. It sounds fun. And it sounds like a good solution. So if we don't have any money, the average working people of Canada, and we want some money, let's go to that rich guy. He's got a top hat and a monocle. He's carrying around a bag with a money symbol on it. And let's go take his money. So it's this kind of simplistic thing of let's just tax the rich to death and we'll have all of their money. So there was all these rumors about a wealth tax happening then. Again, that doesn't work because number one, super duper wealthy rich people, they have teams of accountants and lawyers. They already know how to move their money. Two, physically, if you find the super duper wealthy rich person and you try taking all of their money, they're just going to leave. They're going to pack up and leave the country. Now, believe it or not, I actually had some commentators saying things like, oh, well, we'll have an exit tax for them then. Put that down, folks. Like, you're getting, East Germany level crazy there. Let's not start just thinking of people as these tax vending machines, okay? So all of that was going around before the budget. After the budget and during the budget announcement, they came up with a hike on the capital gains tax. So what that is, and again, it doesn't affect everybody, but what it generally is an increase to the capital gains tax that already exists. So say you've got a lot of investments and you sell them and you make money on it, they're going to then increase the amount that the Trudeau government takes from that, from the profit from it. But it doesn't just affect people who have stocks, who have a lot of investments and stuff. It also affects people if you have a secondary house. So say you're fortunate enough already to have the house that you own and live in right now. Say you're older, okay? Say you're in the boomer generation, okay? A lot of them, right? They would have gotten into the market early. They've paid off their own house that they live in, generally speaking. There's always exceptions, but they're paid off the house they're living in. But quite often they'll have a cottage or a cabin or even like a small apartment or a condo in a downtown area. Quite often they will have rented it out, or they've used it for their adult kid to go through university or trade school. And they're often counting on the sale of that property to be a big part of their nest egg. Okay. They're either going to move to it and live in it when they downsize, when they're old, and sell the house that they currently had lived in, or they're going to sell the secondary property. The reason why I'm explaining all of this is because the sale of a secondary property in Canada carries a capital gains tax. That is what the Trudeau government is proposing to increase. And I use the term proposing lightly because most of the time, if you have a big tax hike and you make the announcement during the budget, it will be part of the budget. Apparently not. From what we can tell, and she has not yet clarified whether or not she's going to do this, what we can tell is that Finance Minister Chrystia Freeland wants the bureaucrats at the finance department to just make this tax hike happen without a vote in Parliament, without a vote in the House of Commons. Okay, so number one, the capital gains tax hike is a dumb idea because it affects a lot of people, including physicians and doctors. We're going to get to that in a second. But also, if you're going to hike taxes, you better at least have a vote on this plan. Okay, so that's totally undemocratic. You have to at least have a vote in the House of Commons on a big tax hike like this. So let's get into a bit of the details here. Sean, if we could pull up some of the data that we have here from Abacus Data. It looks like they asked quite a few questions of Canadians. So let's take a look here. So Abacus Data, again, it's a major polling firm here in Canada. David Coletto, I used to work with him back at Sun News Network. So he runs this shop here. So recall of capital gains tax changes. So 3 in 5 Canadians are informed about the changes to the capital gains in the budget. So that's pretty interesting. So sorry about that, Sean. I have to move my microphone with me here. Thank you. So 3 in 5 Canadians are at least knowledgeable about the capital gains tax changes that was in the budget. So that's pretty decent, right? Enough people know about it. So what did they think about it though? Okay, it's enough to know, but let's think about what they actually think about it. A quarter are supportive. Okay, so that's about 25-ish% of people. This is interesting. A third oppose it, and a remainder remain uncommitted or unsure, meaning they don't quite know enough about it to usually answer. But that number of a third of people saying they oppose it is really interesting. Picture that as a percentage of the population or, votes. All right, let's move along here. So for their initial opinion, only 1 in 5 want the government to pass the capital gains tax changes. So that's, come on, guys, that's less than a quarter. So they're getting into really low territory here. Now, this is where this is very interesting, okay? Because now we're getting into the nitty gritty as to, hey, what does the capital gains tax actually affect? Namely, who does it affect? Doctors. What do we have a shortage of in Canada? Doctors. So the impact of tax changes on physicians and access to physicians. So even before more in-depth information on the impact of doctors, most Canadians believe there will probably be impacts on physicians and waiting lists for care. So those are some really interesting data points there from Abacus data. And that also, anecdotally speaking, is true. So just to give you just a bit of personal background, I'm fine, but I was actually at Foothills Hospital around a month or so ago with a friend. And it was just after the budget was announced and just after the capital gains tax was announced. Completely unprompted, because like I think I had my taxpayers ball cap on or something, but I was not there for work. I was just there with a friend. Two separate doctors spotted the ball cap and they brought up the capital gains tax, saying something like this, if I remember to paraphrase. Yeah, so back when we were first starting med school or thinking about becoming doctors, we were told that because we do not have pensions, okay, the way, say, a nurse would have a pension or other folks within the medical system would have a pension, doctors are basically private enterprises in a way. They have to kind of run their own clinics and then they get hospital privileges. It's a whole complicated thing. But they were told for now, I think more than a generation, by various types of government, that capital gains is their way of saving for that pension. So the way they structure their practice, the way they save their money, okay, is specific to physicians. And now when they're changing the rules midway through the game and they're increasing the capital gains tax, it looks like they're now feeling ripped off. And these two separate doctors mentioned, yeah, I've got friends who are also doctors. Some of them were in Alberta, some of them were in British Columbia, where they certainly can't spare them. And they were saying, you know what? We're going to head out. We're going to move. And that was actually shown. I was watching a recent interview in mainstream media, and one of the cabinet ministers in Trudeau's government was asked about this. Hey, what about the effect on physicians? Okay, what are you going to do about that? And the answer was so flippant, it was jaw-dropping. The minister essentially said, oh, well, we will go find doctors elsewhere and get them to move here. As if there's some magical international doctor store that we can all just go shopping at and just, sure, no problem, bring them over here to Canada where they're going to get screwed on their taxes. So I know there's not a lot of sympathy for super rich people in Canada, but I do think we probably need physicians, right? I have a feeling that we have a shortage of those. Maybe not such a good idea to chase them out of Canada with increasingly higher taxes. And this is the big catch here, okay? Even if you think that increasing the capital gains tax is an answer to the woes of the Trudeau government's budget keeping or lack of budget keeping, that this is the silver bullet, this is the answer, this is going to work. The amount of money that they're going to collect from this increase in the capital gains tax is going to be spent in around 5 days. I'm going to say that again real slow. This huge tax increase where they're going to be screwing people on the sale of a secondary residence. Keep in mind, this also affects if things are passed down in a will to you and you have to sell a family home. Guess what? That's not the house you're living in. You're going to get nailed for that. If you're selling a secondary residence like a condo or a cabin, if you happen to be a physician or some other job where you're directly affected by capital gains, all that money, Trudeau at his current rate of spending, he's going to blow through that in about 5 days. I have lunch meat in my refrigerator that is going to last longer than that amount of money collected. So like the lack of balanced budgets and the increase in deficit spending in Canada is just absolutely mind-boggling here. Folks, if you have comments on capital gains, if you think this is going directly affect you, how you feel this is going to affect physicians, be sure to leave your comments in the YouTube channel comment section. And if there's some pretty interesting and or spicy ones, we'll try to include them in the show. So this is why I love this format, is because it's live and we can be interactive, and we are currently, knock wood, not being controlled much by the government. But that might change. Joining me now to talk about the role of government, the role of taxpayer dollars and censorship here in Canada is Peter Menzies. Mr. Menzies, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for your work on this. I just finished reading your piece. I think if I'm paraphrasing it, the CRTC is coming to help newspapers. Can you tell us a little bit about that? As I understand it, as a former broadcaster myself, CRTC deals with radio and television. They so far haven't gotten their hands on print. How are they now possibly getting their foot in the door when it comes to what we would typically describe as print, even though it's printed on the internet?
Okay, well, the CRTC did deal only with radio and television until the introduction of the Online Streaming Act and passage about a year ago. Bill C-11, it's known as, in its previous incarceration, it was notorious as Bill C-10. And that gave the CRTC authority over the global internet, with the one restriction being that it would only deal with video and audio. So that would keep it within its normal realm, one would think, because the bill envisions that the internet is broadcasting, essentially. So what's happened is they got lobbied heavily in the fall at their hearing, their first introductory hearing on Bill C-11, by Bell Media and other big companies who want funding for their news. They say their news is in crisis, which it probably is. It's in crisis sort of everywhere at the moment under the old structures. So the CRTC announced a couple of weeks ago that it's going to have a consultation followed by a public hearing, and it said it will get into talking about what it wants to talk about is the delivery of quality, trusted news in Canada, including online. So that's what caught my attention because, hey, guess what? Just about everybody's online now, right?
Yeah.
Like if that's that I believe is the primary means of communication. People still watch television, people still listen to the radio, and some people, not many, about 5%, still, buy a printed newspaper. But now, because everybody's online and the CRTC's online, and because just about everything you get online now comes with this little tool that will read the story to you, that's audio. And that, I suspect, is the door that has been kicked open and that the CRTC will walk through.
I gotta ask you, because I read most of your pieces and I really appreciate them. And as a nod to your objectivity, sir, I don't quite know exactly where you stand on some of this, and feel free to not directly answer if you don't feel comfortable. But you worked for a long time with the Calgary Herald as both an editor and publisher, I believe, worked in sports journalism. You did a stint on the CRTC board yourself. What role do you see government playing in media? If you could wave a wand and you could make everything exactly as it should be for objective, independent journalism to occur, what role do you think government should play in newsrooms, if any?
The way the way the communication world is set up today, I believe they should play absolutely none. I think it's absolutely none of their business. I'm very much in agreement with the sort of Jeffersonian view of the world that governments should only do what only governments can do. And they should focus on doing that well and leaving the rest of the world to that. There was recently a clip of the manager of the Spectrum, the Spectator rather, in Britain, speaking to the Scottish Parliament. And I agree with what he said, is that at its core, the relationship between media and government should always be bad.
Yes, it should be adversarial in a way. Even if the journalists themselves, because we're not robots, and I worked in journalism for 20-something years, you're raised a certain way, you have certain opinions, but you can work hard to be balanced and objective in your delivery of your story. Despite where they happen to come from, if it's from a right or left angle, I always thought that it was my job to ask tough questions of the government in power, to speak truth to power, to comfort the afflicted, afflict the comfortable. And now that we're seeing so many journalists outside of the CBC, so many journalists in Canada essentially being on a form of government payroll, it's mind-boggling to think that they could possibly hold government to account. I don't know, Sean, if we have a quote board of Andrew Coyne. I think he said something to the effect of, by 2030, the vast majority of journalists. Pull it up. Go ahead. It's slowly loading here. So if the trends of the past 5 years continue, by 2030, almost 100% of legacy newsroom salaries will be paid, as Coyne put it, the people we write by the people we write about, and almost no one will be bothering to buy what is written. And I thought that your inclusion of that quote was very apt. And it was years ago that Coyne also had pointed out that this is just an obvious conflict of interest. I got to ask you, Peter, how did we get here? Like, if so many journalists feel this way of like, government back off, I don't want to do this here, I'll just shamelessly promote this. This is our magazine, okay? That says Let It Burn. That's written by a dear friend of mine, Ryan Thorpe. He's our investigative journalist now, who spent years in the newspaper industry, an industry he loves. How did we get here? How did we wind up on government payroll as journalists?
Well, I mean, it's a pretty long story, but I mean, to try to make it reasonably tight, I mean, the internet the World Wide Web got invented, and social media invented better ways to reach people for advertisers, much more targeted advertising, much more efficient, much better. Kijiji and Craigslist took away all the classified revenue from newspapers. Newspapers it was very easy to make money in newspapers for a very long time because of their dominance of the market and because they managed not just news, but a lot of stuff. Like I said, classified advertising, that sort of stuff. If you wanted, to buy a car, you wanted to buy a house, you wanted to rent something, that's where you had to go. And then it all just disappeared. Newspapers had no response. And now they find themselves, they cut back and cut back and cut back. And now they find themselves nearing the end of that path of, I guess what you'd say is inability to adjust to technological change. I mean, it's the same as, why don't we have a horse and buggy industry anymore? Somebody invented the automobile. But the fact of the matter is people still move around. So yes. My view is that just because the horse that journalism was riding is dying, it doesn't mean journalism has to die. It just needs to find a new horse. And what they've decided in the meantime, what a lot of the proprietors who were fading away decided in the meantime, was that new horse would be the government, as opposed to serving readers. So you now have a situation, Rudyard Griffiths of the Hub pointed out recently that, I mean, more than 50% of newsroom salaries are now being subsidized either through a tax credit or in some cases directly through Canada. In Quebec, the percentage is even higher because the Quebec government gets into that. And I would also make the point, which I don't think that journalists themselves have to be, are going to be worse because of this. But what people think of them will definitely be worse. And no matter how pristine you believe yourself to be, and no matter how pristine you are in the conduct of your work, if people don't trust that setup, you're done. Yeah. You're cooked. It's over, right? So as Andrew was pointing out, eventually, I mean, if you don't need to serve your readers, right? If you've got enough money, right? If you don't need to sell subscriptions, if you don't need to care about how many people watch your show, if you don't need to care about any of that stuff, why will you, right? You'll just become self-serving and just government funded. I mean, just build a building, right? Make them all public servants and have them move in, right? The pensions are better, right? So, this is not a solution. It's really quite pathetic. Some sort of temporary transitional thing, and there are things government can do. That there are public policies that could be in place that would allow for the CBC being central to this, for journalism to be sustainable. I don't think it's ever going to be as profitable as it once was, but it can be sustainable if government does the right things and stops doing the wrong things.
You really nailed it there when it comes to truth and perception. As a journalist, you're not selling widgets. You're not selling shoes or toothbrushes. You are conveying information, usually information, hopefully, that you as a journalist or reporter has heard firsthand. So if you're covering a court case or city hall, something like that, I know I'm speaking like a dinosaur here because there's so few beat reporters actually out on the street anymore with a mic in their hand. But for a viewer or a reader or a listener consuming that news, you have to trust the person's perception and trust that they have written down the answers as best as they can, as accurately as they can. And if suddenly you no longer trust that conveyor of information, that's it. Like you said, you're done. I saw a recent poll. They put out I forget what it's called, but it's an annual survey on trust that they've put out for 30 something years. And it was a shocking number. I think it was 54% of Canadians now believe that journalists are purposefully saying things they know to be untrue. Not flubbing, not accidentally making a typo, not getting a name wrong, saying they are purposefully misleading people with statements they know to be false. And once you get past that huge mark of 50% in the journalism industry, I don't really see a way back for it here. I wanted to, before I let you go, and I really appreciate your work on this, where do you see censorship coming into this? I'm not sure if you wanted to go there with me, but apart from, I kind of see it as a vice, okay? And it's got two sides. For me, one side of it is government funding of journalists, government involvement in newsrooms, right? Crank, 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 crank. On the other side of it, though, are things like Bill C-11, Bill C-63, which many have said is a form of government censorship. Yes, in the case of Bill C-63, they're trying to couch it in child protection. They should split that bill, okay, and only let that happen on its own. Where do you see government censorship of stifling information, of downgrading people's algorithms to the point where they don't see shows like this anymore? Do you see government playing a role there too?
I think that could happen. I think there's two types of censorship that you'll see. One is self-censorship. Yeah. And for people who argue that no, government funding won't affect our news judgment, I mean, some of the publishers that were pushing for the government funding nakedly used their platforms to campaign for this legislation and stifled dissenting point of views on their pages. So that was self-censorship. I believe in freedom of the press, so they can do whatever they want with their press, but you also have to be accountable for it, right? So if you do that, people will trust you less. That's the outcome of that. And trust is the commodity, as we all know from other parts of our lives, whether at work or personally. Trust, once it is degraded, is very, very difficult to rebuild. It's not something that you can just snap your fingers and get back. So the numbers you quote are alarming. In terms of the government's role, if the CRTC already has control of television and radio in terms of that. And part of the Broadcasting Act says that the CRTC's job is to ensure that the system that they are governing is of high standard. Now that's about as subjective a statement as you can make, right? I mean, right now, I mean, they allow a lot of things. They allow like pornography channels and that sort of stuff that are available to people, and that I assume that they then believe that is of high standard, or they make sure that it's high standard porn. In terms of that, right? Not the cheap stuff, the good stuff.
Yeah. Don't give them ideas; they'll assign a panel.
That's right. But once you get into that, so they've not got carried away with that, but they do have the ability that with that subjective high standard to put things into place. Like the Canadian Broadcast Standards Council was sort of created. The CRTC wanted it to be arm's length, but its decisions can still be appealed to the CRTC. And it sort of sets the guidelines for radio and television, which in my view is one of the reasons why they all kind of seem the same. Like there's not the sort of dynamic diversity of points of view that you see on the internet, because everybody's trying to stay within those set rules. And then you censor within those sorts of things. So the CBSC, for instance, said years ago that the Dire Straits song, Money for Nothing, should be banned.
I remember, because they had that F word in it. Yep.
That's right. And I mean, the artists themselves did an alternative version and that sort of stuff. But that was based on the complaint of one woman in Newfoundland, about a radio station. And she had complained to the radio station, and the radio station had said, okay, in the future, we'll play the other version or something like that. But it wasn't enough. And so once you open that door, what I'm trying to get at is there's no shortage of people out there who will be banging on doors asking for you to be shut down.
Yep.
Right? For all kinds of reasons. There's right now the CRTC still has before it an appeal by a group to have Fox News taken off the off cable in Canada. 2 years ago, they took RT, the Russian state television, off. It took them about 2 weeks to do that because the government isn't allowed to direct them to do something, but the government asked them, nudge, nudge, wink, wink, could you review the status, please, of RT, right? And they got rid of it. There's also complaints before it to get rid of Chinese state television, which I think have been before it for about 4 years now, and they've done absolutely nothing about that. So they deal with what they want to deal with. They don't deal with what they don't want to deal with. And that's the world you're in, where and the big point is, somebody other than your publisher or your owner is looking over your shoulder.
Yep, and that's exactly the world we're in right now. Mr. Menzies, I can't thank you enough for your work on this. Folks, if you care about independent journalism, if you care about government creeping into the newsrooms of the nation and censorship, do pick up Mr. Menzies' work. You can find it all over the place, including the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and several sources online. Sir, thank you so much for your time.
Thanks so much for your interest. Great to chat with you. Thanks.
Thank you. So once again, folks, it's shows like this, okay, that are going to be coming under the eye of the CRTC that Mr. Menzies just described. And if you want shows like this to continue with the free flow of information, if you wish, TV channels like Sun News Network was still around, things like that, we really need to push back on government censorship and government funding of newsrooms, okay? So I do encourage you that if you care about this stuff, read independent journalism, okay, that is not government funded, like Mr. Menzies. Also, pick up the phone, send an email, and make a phone call to your member of parliament. Tell them that independent journalism and a lack of government censorship, a free press in Canada, is a voting issue for you. Hey, speaking of votes, I hear the motherland calling. The United Kingdom is going to be going into an election campaign really soon. And as always, of course, taxpayers are going to be getting screwed again. It sounds like they're not really going to be campaigning on lowering taxes, especially for working people over there in Great Britain. So who's fighting this sort of stuff? Well, you may not know this, but the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, we have kind of distant cousins in different parts of the world. New Zealand is one of them. And over in the UK, there's something called the Taxpayers Alliance. And I wanted to check in right now with a friend of ours. His name is Elliot Keck, and he is with the Taxpayers Alliance. And we're going to chat about government waste and the upcoming election. Elliot, thanks for joining us.
Great to be here.
Now, we always deal with the serious nature of taxpayers getting ripped off on both sides of the pond. Here in Canada, we often talk about things like the carbon tax. We now have a new increase in our capital gains tax. So whenever anybody sells a secondary home, or if you happen to be a physician, you're going to get screwed with higher taxes. But we also get to have a little bit of fun. We hand out our little golden pig statues here to our politicians who waste money. And I saw you guys were having a bit of fun recently. What's going on? You guys have a university that was getting money to decolonize Treasure Island. Can you explain this to us?
Yeah, so I mean, listen, I think the first thing to say is wherever government exists, taxpayers are going to be getting screwed. And it's really just about the degree to which they're being screwed. And some places have it better than others. But yeah, you're right to point to a little bit of research that we did. We regularly go through the grants that universities in the United Kingdom receive. There's a range of different research councils that fund projects in universities. Some of those research councils fund incredibly important work, on science and technology and all the sort of stuff that actually really everybody agrees with. But some of these research councils give money to, frankly, the ridiculous and the absurd. And in one case, £800,000 was given to a university to decolonize the work of Robert Louis Stevenson, of course, the great 19th century Scottish author responsible for Treasure Island, as mentioned there, but also the curious case of Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. And the view of Treasure Island is that, it's about the Caribbean and about a different culture, and that it uses colonial language and colonial terms and a colonial mindset to portray that culture. And it's about time that we decolonize those terms. And now it's one thing to make that argument, but if you're going to do that, I think you can do that on your own dime and not the taxpayers.
Yes, exactly. We have very similar silly nonsense happening over here. We just finished recently having our awards where a lady was paid $30,000 to fly around the world. And at one point, she's an artist. She flopped around on a lawn chair for 8 minutes. Like, this was her art, and we all paid $15,000 for that. Same sort of thing, where if you want to research something like this on decolonizing Treasure Island, why don't they just pay for it themselves? If they think that this is so vital, why do they hit up the taxpayers for it?
Well, I think because they know that they can get various government bodies to fund it. So why fund it yourself if you know that you can trick some unsuspecting bureaucrat or potentially some supportive bureaucrat to pay for it for you? But the problem that we have in the United Kingdom, and I'm sure this is happening to some extent in Canada, is we're finding that these attitudes are spreading from the bits where you'd expect to find those attitudes into the areas where actually you'd think would be cordoned off from them. So just take a recent example. Our Engineering Research Council, a research council that you'd think would be funding very important work, has recently granted £1.5 million to study how men are represented in politics, something completely unrelated to engineering, but yet for some reason that council is funding it to the tune of £1.5 million. So what's really concerning is not just that there is the parts of the state that, let's be honest, you expect to fund this sort of stuff. Actually, that sort of attitude is starting to creep into the bits of the state which you'd expect would be funding serious stuff.
So just to be very clear, you mean engineering, like bridge building and aerospace?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Engineering is a good way to put it.
Now, you guys do have an election process that is slowly going to be rolling out unless the Prime Minister decides to change his mind. What sort of things are you looking for in the UK election from taxpayers? Are there big tax issues going into this vote?
I think there's unlikely to be. The Conservative Party claim that they'll cut taxes in the next election. The reality is that over the last 5 years, they've done very little in the way of tax cuts. In fact, they've done far more in the way of tax rises. So TPA research has found, for example, that the tax burden is heading for an 80-year high at its current trajectory and is already sitting at a 70-year high. So listen, again, as the Conservative Party often does, they talk the talk very well, but it's highly unlikely that if they win the election, they would walk the walk given the previous record. As for the Labour Party, they're trying to say as little as possible on tax. They don't want to scare the median voter that they feel like, and which the polls suggest that they have won over. The couple of things they have announced are pretty disastrous policies, but unfortunately they do appeal to certain voters. And the main one that they're going with at the moment is VAT on private schools.
Wow. Okay. I know we only have a few minutes with you, and I really appreciate your time. I saw you did a brilliant interview a little while ago on axing the TV tax. Now, as far as I understand, that is a special sort of tax that the BBC, so your version of the CBC, imposes on people who have television sets, and they're now spending taxpayers' money going after folks who they think haven't paid their TV fees. Is that right?
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. So this is a pretty outdated system that only exists in a handful of countries now. So the reason why it exists is in the 1920s when the BBC was set up, that was the only channel you could get. There wasn't the bandwidth to create other channels, and nor could you block people from getting the BBC. So basically, if you bought a TV, you'd have access to the BBC. You couldn't be precluded from access to the BBC, and therefore a TV license was an appropriate fee to charge for people to own a TV. But you can now stop people from getting the BBC. We have that ability. You can stop people and getting any channel that you want to. And unfortunately, we haven't moved on from this funding model. So anybody that watches live television, and that's any form of live television on any channel, has to pay the license fee. It's about £169, which is somewhere in the region of about 250 to 300 Canadian dollars. And whether you watch the BBC, whether you support its content, and even if you loathe its content, you are legally required to pay it.
Wow, that sounds so similar to what we're dealing with over here. The CBC takes $1.4 billion from us every single year. It's astonishing. It's the equivalent of about 7,000 police officers and 7,000 paramedics' salaries every single year. We just, at the Taxpayers Federation, we want to completely defund it. if people love watching CBC, we think they should pay through a subscription. I just find it really interesting how many similarities and parallels there are across the pond. Lastly, if you don't mind me asking you, where are you guys in the UK when it comes to the government interfering with online expression, with things like podcasts, things like the show we're having right now? So here in Canada, we've got a few different laws that are really starting to clamp down on how people can express themselves. Where are you guys with that? Are you guys having any government interference when it comes to censorship and free expression?
Well, recently we saw the online safety bill passed, and this was a bill that was designed, or at least so its advocates claim, to protect children from accessing potentially harmful content on the internet. It also strengthened restrictions on illegal content, and those bits of the bill were broadly supported, but it also created a requirement for companies such as social media companies to restrict legal but harmful content to adults and ensure that adults were not seeing harmful content, even if it was legal. Now, there's been a lot of very, very serious warnings from many organizations about the potential ramifications for this. We've only just seen the bill pass, and so we're yet to see what its actual impacts are. But I mean, certainly those that have far more expertise than me are warning that it could be very chilling for free speech.
Wow, that's uncanny, really, because we now have Bill C-63. It's not yet passed. It's literally referred to as the Online Harms Act. And the same sort of thing. There's a whole bunch in there that is perfectly fine for people to pass. Any decent person would want it passed because it's to protect children from, images of child sexual abuse, all heinous things that any decent person would want in our criminal code, which, by the way, it's already illegal. It's already in the criminal code. But couched in that is, of course, what certainly looks like a clampdown on what should be legal free expression. And so it's a little uncanny to see so many parallels. Elliot, we really appreciate your work over there on the other side of the pond. Thank you so much for standing up and fighting for taxpayers in the UK.
Thank you.
And back here on this side of the pond in Canada, we're continuing to fight for taxpayers. And this is something that Andrew would have talked to Carson about, I'm sure, because it's a ridiculous waste of money and it's also hilarious. So remember at the beginning of the show when I said, hey, imagine it's fall and you were gearing up with your buddies and you guys were going to go deer hunting. What sort of stuff would you bring along with you? What sort of vehicle would you take? Well, what about gigantic sniper rifles and a helicopter? Yeah, just add government. Joining us now is the British Columbia director for the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, my good friend Carson Binda. Carson, you've got... I remember when we were first talking about this story at work, I thought that this was must have been a misunderstanding. Can you please explain to our listeners and our viewers here on the Andrew Lawton Show, how much money did taxpayers spend hunting deer out of a helicopter, and how did this happen?
Yeah, you're absolutely right, Kris. They are spending a mind-boggling amount of money culling deer from this tiny little island, Sidney Island, just off the coast of Victoria. Now, Parks Canada, instead of working with the local community, culling these deer, they decided to fly in snipers from New Zealand and the United States to circle this island in a helicopter, shooting down on the deer below. During phase 1 of the project, they spent about $800,000 to kill 80 deer. That works out to about 10 grand per deer. But hold on, folks, because that's just the tip of the iceberg. We dug up through access information requests that the true cost of this project, $12 million. They are spending $12 million, Kris, doing something that the local community has been doing for a decade for free.
Okay, so for folks who just woke up from a coma, here in Canada, hunting, especially things like hunting deer, is a pretty standard operating procedure, especially in parts of rural Canada. Lots of people, were raised on venison or moose meat. Bambi's not my favorite show, but come on, shooting deer out of a helicopter? I think even seasoned hunters have a problem with that.
Absolutely. And look, the proof's in the pudding. We flew in these expert marksmen. We spent hundreds of thousands of dollars getting them trained on using the weapons, the assault rifles they were shooting from the helicopters. But they missed about 20% of the time. 20% of the deer they killed were the wrong species. Now, if
Oh.
you talk to any hunter here in British Columbia, which we've been doing, if they shoot the wrong species of deer, the park ranger comes and takes their rifle and their truck. But
Yeah.
Parks Canada managed to shoot the wrong type of deer from these helicopters 20% of the time. So these so-called expert marksmen that we spent hundreds of thousands of dollars bringing in, renting a helicopter for them, getting them trained up, they are clearly the worse option than just working with the local community. And like I said, local hunters on Sidney Island have been doing deer culls for a decade. Just last fall, they killed 54 of the right kind of deer at no cost to the taxpayer. So this is one of those bizarre stories where if you ever want to waste money, just sprinkle in a few bureaucrats and they will dream up the most absurdly expensive ways of doing anything.
Wow. And you know why the local hunters shot the right deer? Because they can see them and they know what they are and they live in the area. And when they look through their scope, they're like, oh, that's the right kind of deer. Bang. Like this, it's really mind blowing. And to your point on, fish and game, there's fish cops in Canada. If you catch the wrong fish, if it's like a centimeter too small, like I can't even imagine the punishment that will be rained down upon you from the government. But when it's the government actually using our money, that's just fine. They can shoot the wrong deer from a helicopter. Have we gotten any response from Parks Canada about this?
Absolutely nothing. I held a press conference here in Victoria yesterday, and just about every media outlet in the province reached out to Parks Canada and said, hey, guys, how'd you manage to spend $12 million hunting a few deer? Why'd you fly in foreign sharpshooters instead of working with the local community at no cost to the taxpayer? So far, we haven't heard a word from Parks Canada. So the bureaucrats are struggling to come up with any explanation for how they managed to waste so much of your money.
Now, lastly, years ago, back in my Vancouver Island days, I remember there was a controversy, I think it was up north in BC, of shooting wolves from a helicopter. Like that's bad enough because then maybe you're not harvesting the pelts, but people don't technically, really eat wolf meat. I've been getting a lot of questions and I'm sorry I haven't asked you this yet off air. Do we know what happened with the meat that was shot by the dudes in the helicopter? Like not the dudes on the ground, the dudes from, what is it, the States and New Zealand who shot the wrong deer. What happened to that meat?
Yeah, so they harvested some of the meat. I think it's about 800 kilograms of meat that they were able to harvest.
Okay.
But let's do some math here. They spent $100,000 to harvest 800 kilograms of meat. That's $1,000 per kilogram. I mean, I know grocery prices are through the roof right now, but I've never seen a steak or some venison sausages at my local butcher that cost $1,000 per kilogram. It's incredible how much money they managed to waste culling these deer. I mean, it is truly Parks Canada bureaucrats role-playing as Rambo, working with Americans and New Zealanders to shoot deers from helicopters. Kris, it is mind-boggling, and I think more than that, it just speaks to the culture of waste that we've allowed to fester in our federal bureaucracy. It's unacceptable, and taxpayers like you and I, who are struggling to make our rent and mortgage payments, who are struggling to feed our families, I think Parks Canada owes us an explanation.
Yeah,
Why
they
do
should.
choose to fly in foreign snipers instead of working with the local community for free.
They sure do. Carson and to the entire team that worked on this, thank you so much for bringing us this story. And hey, folks, if this bothers you, phone up your member of parliament. Tell them to get on the horn with Parks Canada. Thanks, Carson.
Thanks so much, Kris. It's always a pleasure.
So, as we were just saying, hunting is an essential element of Canadian culture for so many people. Like we were speaking with Tracy Wilson earlier this week on the Andrew Lawton Show, I think we are the seventh highest level of legal law-abiding gun ownership in the entire world. Okay, those tools are usually used for things like deer hunting. Frankly, there's no shortage of people on Vancouver Island or on the mainland who would have been willing to go over there if they'd just been given the permission to go harvest those deer much more humanely, frankly, than shooting them out of a helicopter and hiring foreigners to come over and do it. So again, this just speaks to the culture of waste coming from the federal government and a lack of understanding of true Canadian culture. So today is May 23rd, and I wanted to leave you with this element of Canadian culture. And I'm sorry that it's a sad one, but I think it's really important to mark this date. So on this date, May 23rd, 25 years ago, Canadian wrestling legend Owen Hart died. So a lot of you might remember where you were if you're a wrestling fan here in Canada when you heard the news. I actually was on the air in the radio station, funny, in Vancouver Island when we heard about this. And so there's a lot of controversy about what happened, but it was, of course, one night in Kansas City, and he was supposed to be coming down about 8 stories from the rafters of this Coliseum for a big live event there with a bunch of wrestling fans surrounding him. And he was supposed to be coming down on rigging. Something happened with that rigging, and Owen Hart sadly fell to his death. And I just wanted to mark it because wrestling, professional wrestling, is a huge part of Canadian culture. And he would have been 59 years old this year. So super sad to see that happen. Just wanted to mark it that it was, wow, time flies. 25 years ago today, Owen Hart passed away. Wow, look at that picture. Phil was mentioning, one of our producers here was mentioning, I think they're all gone now, except for Brett. God bless him. Yeah, we got Davey Boy Smith. We've got Owen Hart. Owen's the one there with the blonde buzz cut without the sunglasses. Then we got Bret Hart, who, thank God, is still with us. He's a good old Alberta boy. And then his dear buddy there, Jim the Anvil Neidhart, who I believe was his brother-in-law, as was Davey Boy Smith. So just wanted to say, so sorry to Owen Hart's family. May he rest in peace, and condolences and God bless to his loved ones. Goodbye.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.